to our keynote. We're incredibly excited to have Professor Marshall van Alstyne with us today. Professor van Alstyne is the Allen and Kelli Questrom Chaired Professor in Information Systems at Boston University. He's also a Digital Fellow at MIT IDE. Marshall is one of the world's foremost experts on network business models and co-author of the international bestseller Platform Revolution. I met Marshall on many occasions. Launchworks has been invited to the Platform Strategy Research Symposium and the MIT Platform Strategy Summit in Boston. And by the way, don't miss the next one on the 17th of July. So today, Marshall is going to talk to us about his latest research on how to deal with misinformation and fake news on social media. So Marshall, it's a pleasure to welcome you on Platform Leaders. Over to you.
Laure, kind of you to have me on board. Thank you so much for the invitation. Let me speak directly to the audience. There's so many issues involved, and I really would like to make this a conversation, because I personally think that the misinformation problem is one of the biggest challenges we face today. We can't solve issues of global warming or who's president or whether vaccines work or not if we cannot agree on basic facts. And I think our political situation is one that's actually quite concerning. For those of you who may or may not know, our own research on misinformation was canceled by the current administration. So it's an interesting time that we are in. I do want to offer, however, a message of hope, because I actually think what I'd like to present today is what I think are some possible solutions. I'm going to argue that our current approaches don't necessarily work very well. I'll see if I can explain why I think that's the case and what we might do differently. But I actually want to give you two different things. One of them is a theory of what might actually help solve the problem. And then the second is a bit of evidence. We've actually done a bit of research and want to see if we can provide some of those. So I want to separate these two separate things. So let me launch in and see what you can think of what's happening. I do think misinformation is implicated in a large number of different problems concerning us today. So for example, misinformation has been implicated in, the insurrection. Let's see, we need to continue to share. Make sure that everything's visible. Laure, is everything visible okay? I want to make sure that it...
Yes, it's working perfectly fine, Marshall.
Wonderful. Okay. So social media and misinformation were implicated in the insurrection in the United States. They were implicated in the insurrection in Brazil. Misinformation was also implicated in the riots in the UK, where there were false claims of someone stabbing children when in fact it was a British citizen. In fact, misinformation and social media have been implicated in a huge number of different problems, including insurrection, riots, lynching, money laundering, suicide, sex trafficking, drug trafficking, child exploitation, judicial intimidation, terrorist recruiting. The historian and philosopher Yuval Noah Harari asked this wonderful question. If social media are connecting us in ways that bring us together, why is everyone so angry? And it doesn't matter where you look, whether it's in Israel or the UK or France or Germany or Brazil, or the United States. There's a lot of polarization that's taking place. So what is it that's happening? What is it that we could do about it? I'd like to thank a UK team for trying to summarize all of the interventions on misinformation. So there was a report that came out last year. And this is a summary of all the ones that are tried out across the globe. And the bubbles here represent, the color represents the type of intervention, whether it's accuracy prompt or friction or media literacy tips or social norms. And then also the locations around the globe where these studies have actually been tried out. And a large number of different things have been tried across the globe. If we summarize them, however, I would argue that each of them suffers from a large number of different problems. So the blue lists the interventions and their complications. And if I've omitted any, please reach out to me. I actually would love to hear from you. But I think every single one of these interventions suffers from at least one, if not four, of the following problems. So the first is the arms race, and this is particularly problematic, as Laure just mentioned, for artificial intelligence. Deep fakes are going to make this even more problematic, as you could make politicians or individuals appear to do or appear to say things that they never even considered or did at all. And so you're trying to use technology to create and detect, and yet there's always going to be another mechanism to avoid detection. So the arms race is a deep problem. Another one, if somebody's doing the fact checking, then the people that are lying are entirely happy to lie about the parties that are fact checking them. So they actually then try to simply discredit them. And this is one of the reasons we're having such problems with our institutions today. So science is being discredited, academics are being discredited, government institutions, churches, any organization that then stands in the way of those who would disseminate misinformation are being discredited. Another one is, I think, subtler. And this is one I think that is not appreciated in most of the interventions, is I think they put the responsibility on the wrong foot. Solutions such as community notes put it on the let users decide as opposed to the source. But I ask you the question, does it make social sense for one individual, the author, to check their facts once before distributing it to thousands of people or millions of people? Or does it make sense for thousands of people or millions of people to have to check it? Well, the social costs of the latter are overwhelmingly in the wrong direction. So I think that we need to see if we can put responsibility on the authors of content rather than the recipients of content. In a pollution context, that would be the equivalent of asking citizens to wear gas masks and filter their own water, as opposed to ask the factories to stop polluting. The last one is one that not a single one of these solutions, and no other solutions that I'm aware of, makes it cheaper to do honest journalism than it is to make stuff up. It's really easy, and especially now with generative AI, to make stuff up. So fake news and misinformation are extremely easy to create and share, and honest truth is very hard to dig up. So the cost structure favors falsity over fact. But I want to diagnose the problem differently. So I want to think, most people think the problem in some sense is truth or fakeness of it. And I'm going to argue that's not the nub of the problem. I'll give you an example. Much false information just doesn't matter. What about an ad exaggeration or irony or parody or fake news that's disbelieved? It's not a problem. I love this particular, compliment. The planet's fine. The people are effed. This was George Carlin talking about global warming. Well, of course, the planet's not fine, but he's using parody to highlight some of the problems. Or think about truth. In many cases, true news that's disbelieved is a potential problem. You make the bad policy decisions. Or sometimes anti-vax groups will use two truths to create a lie. They might argue that the famous politician Colin Powell received the COVID vaccine and still died of COVID anyway, implying that it was ineffective, but they omit the fact that he had blood cancer and so would have died anyway. So that's another interesting element of it. Or I credit the Allen team and others for highlighting this true claim. It was actually in the Chicago Tribune that a healthy doctor died 2 weeks after getting the COVID vaccine, CDC investigating. This went massively viral on Instagram and Facebook with over 50 million views. And it was a true statement, and it was never flagged because it was a true statement. And yet, after the fact, it was discovered, of course, that he died of stomach problems completely unrelated to the COVID vaccine. So it did cause interesting problems. I'm going to argue that it's decision errors and externalities. Well, what are externalities? Externalities are damage that occurs off platform. So this might be a pizza parlor shooting or clickbait on water where they claim that there are clear worms in Dasani water. And Coca-Cola and the Federal Trade Commission had to put out their own separate statements to say this wasn't true, but it was being created as clickbait. Or Salman Rushdie is stabbed by someone who was radicalized from third-party readings of the videos or watching videos and had never even read his works. Or if you consider the loss of herd immunity from the anti-vax propositions. In the United States, we now have measles outbreaks coming out of Texas that are the worst of in 50 years because folks weren't vaccinated. We're not taking action on global warming, or we're seeing insurrections. These are damages that occur off-platform that the platforms themselves are not internalizing. And here's why this is interesting. All too often, our solutions are to turn the problem over to, quote, what was often called the marketplace of ideas. And this just doesn't actually work. In fact, you often want government intervention to do this, but we don't, you often lead to or promote government intervention to solve these kinds of problems, but this has other complications. The implications of this are twofold, and I want to use this as description, explanation, and eventually resolution. Here, the idea is there's too much pollution taking place. This also explains why social media have made this different than it was 20, 30 years ago, or even 15 years ago. Now, everybody's a producer of information. There's lots of production of the pollution, but no one is internalizing the cost. It's really hard to hold individuals accountable. And under our current laws, the platforms are not accountable. In the United States, it's the Section 230. In Europe, it's the Digital Services Act. So the platforms are not themselves necessarily accountable for user-generated content, making it problematic. The second is there's too little correction. Attempts by courts or society to use the marketplace of ideas to sort things out, to let users decide, will fail. The reason: markets do not self-correct market failures. Externalities are market failures. So we need some kind of intervention to actually solve the problem. So again, I want to use that as both explanation for what's happening, why it's become so problematic, but that then also gives us some levers for possibly dealing with it. To give you some theories. In economics, we have two ways that we know of, only two. Imagine that there are factories that are dumping pollutants into the air and the water. The first of these are given to us by Arthur P. Gu, and he has really interesting ideas. Well, you can either tax the sales, such as in social media, that would be advertising, put a quota on effluent. These are government solutions, they're centralized solutions. The problem with that is that the government quota on speech is what? That is censorship. That's the very definition of censorship. So it's extremely hard to use those kinds of solutions. Looking back more carefully, this is one of the things we've been working on for the research. This is the theory part. There's an entirely different set of ideas developed by Ron Coase, who won the Nobel Prize, partly for transactions cost theories, but also for his theories on externalities. An externality, a market, where there are negative externalities, where there's pollution, does not internalize the harms. Rather than having the government do it, there may be ways of using decentralized solutions to actually solve this problem. In his original context was radio spectrum. So one tower might broadcast at increased signal, interfering with another, and that would both increase their signals, creating radio noise. His insight was, it's not the government that says, okay, radio tower A should produce and B should not. Rather, you create property rights in the spectrum so that the best use case can buy it. So if A has the best use case, they can buy it. If B has the best use case, they can buy it. And if C comes up as a startup, they could buy it later. And you get much more efficient solutions from this decentralized. Now, how would we implement that in the context of misinformation and speech? Well, this raises the question, what is the scarce resource? That's the resource that's being abused. In this picture, it's land, it's air, and water. In our case, it's attention. What is it that information is consuming? What is it that's being abused? Herbert Simon, another Nobel Prize winner, argues information consumes something that's obvious. It's the attention of its recipients. It's your attention that's being abused by social media and other institutions, other technology companies. So how would we then create property rights in attention? Here's my suggestions as to ways you might actually do this. What I want to do is I want to give you an expanded set of rights, not a diminished set of rights, but an expanded set of rights. So here they are. So this is, again, the third portion of it. So first, I want to give you a fundamental right in your own attention. The first of these is a listener's right. You can listen to any source you want, right? This means you have the right to focus your attention on your preferred sources. So if there are a lot of polluted information streams, you could focus on the clean information streams. You could choose the BBC. You could choose the Financial Times. You could choose, the German newspapers. But there's a complication. You can also choose, you can choose Breitbart. You could choose whatever one you want. The complication, however, is then filter bubbles. You could choose to hear only what you believe, so you could actually become isolated. That's the downside. That's the extreme use or exercise of that right. Balancing that, I want to give you another additional right. I want to give you a speaker's right to be heard. This is an individual expressive right to influence decisions that affect you, to counter disagreeable speech with agreeable speech, but influencing decisions entails the right to being heard. What's fascinating is no country in the world I'm aware of grants a right to be heard. Even the most expensive set of rights in the United States is a right to speak. It is not a right to be heard. Matter of fact, there's even an expression, you have a right to speak, you don't have a right to reach. Interestingly enough, the free exercise of that right in its extreme also has its own downside, which is you could lie to people or you could jam their signals, you could speak over them. you can use their attention to your private advantage. What I'd like to do is propose a way. So how do you balance the right not to hear against the right to be heard? What I want to do is I want to give you an argument for a way to cancel both the negative effects and capture the positive effects. I want to cancel the filter bubble and cancel the lying. I want to give you the right to override the right not to be heard, but conditional on accepting liability for misuse of your right. We're going to use a Coasian insight. So if you didn't want to hear me, I could actually then vouchsafe that what I'm claiming is true. Notice I'm the source, I'm the author of the content. And then it would be presented almost as if it were an ad. Give you a simple illustration. Here's a possible implementation. So I want to move from the theory to the implementation. Imagine, for example, that just like an advertisement, you might place 3 times the normal ad price in escrow, and then it would be presented to the audience. If no one proves that it's false, I get it back so that it's free. If anyone proves that it's false, they claim that value and it becomes theirs. They're motivated to prove that I'm actually not telling the truth. Now I'm the source and I have to make a choice. If I know I'm lying, well, I'd want to use a traditional ad. If I know I'm telling the truth, I'd want to use this vouchsafe mechanism because it's free to me. But it's now a credible signal to the other side in a way that actually makes it to work. Notice this gives you the right to pierce a filter bubble. If someone else is not listening and you want to be able to present facts, this gives you that right and it's free. Notice, however, that if you're going to try to lie, it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be way more expensive than simply taking out an ad. So that's the theory. We tested it. So I'd like to give credit to my co-authors on some research. We actually did a little bit of experimental testing on this. And the way so Nichols, Parker, Mazar, Pennycook, and Rand were all joining us. What we did is we tested this among it's in 2 different sets. So one is in about 1,500 social media users, and another's about 2,000 social media users. It's over 30,000, and collectively it's over 60,000 responses. And it's distributed across the population among men, women, trans, Democrat and Republican, and others. And so here's what we checked. We presented headlines and asked folks, would they be willing to share? And with just like social media, we're going to reward you starting for interesting stuff. You'll get 5 cents. And if you're sharing boring stuff, they'll take away 5 cents. Or you could choose to do absolutely nothing if you don't think that it's interesting or boring, and you can do nothing. It's like social media where you're being rewarded with followers and likes for sharing interesting content. The next condition was one of the standard tests. It's an accuracy nudge. We'll simply make you think, or remind you that if you share true information, you could do it, or share false. It could have implications, but there's no consequence. You're going to get the exact same reward if you're sharing false information, and you're going to get the exact same reward if you're sharing interesting information. It's just making you think about it. The third one is the mechanism we're talking about, where in this case, it's binding. This means that if you pierce a filter bubble with false information, it's going to cost you 10 cents. If you pierce a filter bubble with correct information, you're going to be rewarded with 10 cents. You have the choice of any of these. You can still try to share the information without warranting, and it won't cost you anything. You could choose not to share. You have all of the options of the above. So there's no requirement at all. It's simply a voluntary option. So here's what we found in the first study, okay? Well, sure enough, and the yellow is false and the blue is true in these stories. And sure enough, in the normal condition, well, folks are sharing the interesting content, and so they're sharing more falsity than truth. So we had a completely balanced panel. It was across half boring, interesting stories, half true, false stories. But in this condition, they're sharing more false stories than true. Why? Because you're being rewarded for interesting content. When we reminded you that it was true or false, there's no reduction in the sharing of the interesting stuff, but folks tended to share more true information. So there was a statistically significant increase in the sharing of truth. But in the costly condition, notice, by the way, so there's no effect on the sharing of falsity. But in the costly condition, under the vouchsafe condition, if it's binding, we get this big improvement in the sharing of truth, not only relative to the control, but even relative to the reminder. So folks share even better, and we get this benefit that falsity also decreases. In other words, the total discernment is much better. You get a reduction in falsity and an increase in truth compared to either the baseline or just the reminder. So that's on the sharing side. We reran the same set of experiments, now asking the recipients, what did they think? So after you'd received a story, what would it look like? So we labeled it's the exact same set of headlines, and now there's a case of A, no label at all. Case B, you would learn that other people had shared the story. Does this make it more or less credible? And then there are cases C and D where, one, they're reminded to share true, but there's no consequence if they don't. And then the last one is case D, where it's binding. If they share truth, it's binding. If they share falsity, it's going to cost them 10 cents. And you then had to rate the story on whether or not you thought it was not at all accurate, which is 1. Intermediate was 4. And if you thought it was completely accurate, then it was rated on 7. Here's what we found. Okay, in information economics, this was signaling and screening, right? You're getting, signal is it a more credible signal or not? And screening is, on the recipient side, do they believe it or not? Well, the first part is good news. People were actually able to discern true and false stories. So remember, on a scale, 1 was false and 7 was completely true. So it's actually true. So if you looked at the true stories, folks tended to rate them a little above 5. You looked at the false stories, folks tended to rate them around 2. So great, they actually perceived correctly. If they learned that it had been shared, no effect. It wasn't more credible or less credible. If they learned that it was a reminder to share true information, then it was actually more credible. So folks actually found it more believable. And then finally, if it was vouchsafed, if folks were willing to not only stake their reputation, but also they had to pay for it if they were lying to you, this was even more statistically significant. So that was even more credible. Exact same story, but a stronger signal in here. One interesting thing that we didn't expect that was kind of fascinating was that if you were to vouchsafe a false story, then that was more credible too. So that strong signal actually made false stories appear more accurate. And so that was quite interesting. The one other thing that we had not expected that was really kind of interesting and very promising for the business models was if you take the social media baseline case, out of 24 stories, they might share 7.8. Under the warrant condition, they shared 9.4. That means engagement went up, not down, but up. If you look across a lot of the different interventions, they add friction to it, and which is, unattractive to the business models because it reduces the engagement. But this is a voluntary option to pierce filter bubbles. With this voluntary option to do gain additional reach for your communications, folks, you liked this, and they actually shared more stories overall. So let me quickly summarize. Here's a list of a bunch of different benefits, but if you look at the ones marked in green, 1, 3, 4, 9, and the others, those address every single one of the problems I mentioned with the other interventions. This changes the cost structure so that it's actually cheaper to tell the truth. You can pierce a filter bubble with vouchsafed facts in it. It avoids the arms race problem because we're using mechanism design. You're using juries to actually do the adjudication. So it's extremely hard to actually discredit a peer jury in this context. So it avoids the arms race, and we address the AI pending problem. It also changes the misplaced responsibility. Who's the first party to certify? It's the author. So you're more likely to actually tell the truth because it's your decision in here. It's putting the burden back on the source, not on the destination. And they're just drawing attention to the last 2. Notice, at no point in any of this is any content censored at all. We've simply given you the right to signal that you're telling the truth and to reach an audience you wouldn't otherwise reach. There's no friction on any audience that wanted to hear you because that's their listener's right. Notice also, there is by design absolutely no central authority at all. Not government, not platform, not Elon Musk, not Mark Zuckerberg. Nobody is able to influence or bias the outcome. Not even I as the designer could bias the outcome. So for those of you that are interested, we have 2 working papers on that. So the theory is in the first one. It's free speech and the fake news problem. And the evidence is under review. That's Truth is Warranted, the impact of self-certification on misinformation. The other 2 papers, so what I presented is 1 and 4. The other 2 papers are policy papers on how we might actually implement some of these ideas, either on platforms themselves or in the law. And with that, by all means, please give me your toughest questions. Please disagree with anything you would like. I'd like to hear your thoughts on what we can do better, because I'd really like to help solve this problem. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Marshall. That was really fascinating presentation. We've got some great questions that came through the chat. There's one from Anna, and I think there's another one which is along the same line. So I'm going to ask this one. So your proposed system aligns really well with the US regulatory context, where litigation is shaping outcomes. So how applicable would it be in an EU context where the rule-based ex-ante regulation obligations, like those under the DSA, or even in a UK context where it's principles-based? What would be the adaptations that would be required?
So I love that question. So I'd like to make an a fortiori argument, the point being that if it can work under the most restrictive conditions, being the most restrictive where government can't intervene, this is in the United States, then it ought to work even more easily in less restrictive conditions. So in the UK or in Europe, it's easier for government to intervene. So my argument is that it's been designed to work under the most restrictive conditions. So I'm hoping that it would be able to work anywhere, perhaps even in totalitarian countries, were they willing to allow it? Because there's no central authority in here. The market should become self-cleaning because folks are internalizing their externalities. So I'm optimistic that by the theory, again, this would remain to be tested out, by the theory, it should require no adaptation at all in order to be adapted from a US context to a UK context or Brazilian or European context. That's the hope.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marshall, for your presentation. And there's lots of questions in the chat. If you want to answer them directly, please feel free to do so. But unfortunately, we have to move on to our next panel, Regulating for Growth. So let
me just say thank you for hosting me. And folks that are interested, by all means, use the email below. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you. And Laure, thanks for the conversation.
Thank you so much, Marshall.